Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. US President Donald Trump says a Gaza ceasefire is closer than ever, but what's the reality? The White House has released a plan to end the Gaza war after Trump held talks with Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli leader has apparently agreed to the 20-point plan, which still requires sign-off from Hamas. After nearly 2 years of war, the powers that be seem hopeful an end is near. Trump has said if Hamas doesn't agree to the deal, it's going to be, and I quote, a very sad end. But given a number of provisions are ones the terror group has previously vetoed, how realistic is it? And who would govern Gaza once the dust settles anyway? Today on the front page, Australian National University Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies senior lecturer Dr Anas Iqtait is with us to discuss the latest in the plan for peace. First off, Anas, can you tell me about this plan? What are some of the main conditions that stood out to you?
I think the most important elements of this plan is the fact that many Arab and Islamic countries have been quick to endorse it. And it also came after a meeting between Trump and many leaders of Arab and Muslim majority countries like Turkey and Pakistan, and many of those in the Arabic world as well. So this is the most important element in this plan, which means that for Hamas, now it is in a very difficult position, because if it refuses the plan or it suggests major revisions to the plan's pillars as they stand at the moment, it loses also, or it potentially loses the very little support it still has amongst certain Arab and also Islamic audiences, particularly at the policy level. So this is the most important element, in my opinion, behind this plan, which suggests that we may be seeing Hamas agreeing to it in the coming days.
I mean, Trump has said that Israel would have his full backing to continue going after Hamas if the group rejects the deal. How do we expect Hamas, though, to agree to something that would see them excluded from any future governing role, though? I mean, is it realistic to believe that a terrorist organisation would willingly agree to that?
I think the context of the Palestinian political system here and political field is very important. The plan itself has elements where Hamas seems to have full control over. So, for example, the release of Israeli hostages in Gaza, as well as some of the pillars that relate to the movement disarming, something that we still haven't heard a response for by Hamas at the moment. So these are pillars that Hamas has direct control over in many ways. But then there is the wider Palestinian political field. The plan makes this assumption, which basically equates the Palestinian polity in Gaza with Hamas, and then also separates Gaza from its wider Palestinian context. And this is precisely where the second element, which is the factors that are not necessarily under Hamas's control. So, for example, who decides who's going to govern the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip? And why is it that the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are being proposed to be governed by this sort of international coalition that may include Palestinian names on it or technocratic names? And why is this governance system or mechanism is separate from wider Palestinian governance? And why is Hamas to make a decision about the political future of the Gaza Strip alone? So these are things that the plan leaves ambiguous and puts the ball in Hamas's field, if you will, with regards not only to the day-to-day events or let's say the technical aspects that are related to the war, but then also to the future of the Palestinians at large in the Gaza Strip, which will definitely have ramifications to the future of Palestinians elsewhere as well.
Yeah, you mentioned that the plan involves denying Hamas any future, obviously, in governance, but it calls for 2 levels of interim governance. That's that international body and a Palestinian committee. Do you see that as a good solution?
Well, absolutely not. Again, I think this is sort of a governance model that is being imposed internationally on the Palestinians. And here I would just like to separate Hamas from this discussion, because this is what I was referring to in my earlier point, that the future of the Palestinian political field is not in the hands of Hamas to decide on alone. Hamas is part of the Palestinian political fabric within the Palestinian political field, but so it's not in the hands of Hamas alone to make a decision on this. And then two, we have moved past colonial governance infrastructures, right, and mechanisms. So at least in the vast majority of the world, not in the Palestinian context, it seems, imposing sort of a governance mechanism that is going to be chaired by the President of the United States on Palestinians, even if it has some Palestinian voices, is, in my opinion, will certainly prove to be unproductive, inefficient, and will backfire because the plan will not result in what it's being promoted that it's going to result in the future, at least in the intermediate and long terms.
Yeah, I saw that this board of peace as well, it would include former British PM Tony Blair, as that's a name that's been thrown out into the ether as well, involving being involved in this. In terms of Palestinian governance, do you think anyone has been involved in the discussions in this plan from the Palestinian side? So
my understanding is that the Arab leaderships or the Arab presidents and heads of states who met with Trump in New York have conveyed these points to the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority has been quick to agree to the plan as a blueprint, at least as a general blueprint to end the war in Gaza. That said, it really reminds me of rounds of negotiations between Arabs and Arab leaders and Israel before the Madrid peace process in 1991. This is basically where Israel used to refuse to represent or to meet with Palestinians to negotiate with them in their capacity as Palestinians, and would prefer to meet with the Jordanian leadership or other Arab leaders on behalf of the Palestinians. And this is precisely the parallel that I'm drawing here. It's an international mechanism, the United States as the leading state that is behind this mechanism, that has sort of a consensus amongst the Arab leadership and then consensus amongst the international community. In the early 1990s, this resulted in the Oslo Accords. And from Palestinians' perspective, there is consensus amongst Palestinian academics, analysts, observers that the Oslo Accords has been a failure and was heavily criticized at the time as well. So there is a lot of, in my opinion, there's deja vu. There's a lot of parallel between where we are heading with Gaza and the Madrid peace process. The only difference here, obviously, is that the Gaza situation is being separated from the wider Palestinian situation or the wider Palestinian narrative and aspirations, which is really worrying. And worrying from the perspective that it will, in my opinion, most likely result in many issues in the intermediate and long terms that can backfire to the stability for the region, also for the aspirations of Palestinians as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction to make, like you said as well, the Gaza situation and the Palestinian situation. And because that they're focusing on Hamas, I see here, and another point to make, I suppose, is that the plan also promises amnesty to members of Hamas who agree to peaceful coexistence and to decommission their weapons. Again, is this realistic, or is this just a power play from the powers that be to make ensure everyone knows that they tried. When it fails, they have permission to go and do what they want?
Yes, on this very point, minutes after Trump obviously declared this plan, Netanyahu commented on it, standing next to Trump. And this is This is something that Netanyahu clearly said was not going to happen. From Netanyahu's perspective, or the way that Netanyahu is interpreting the peace plan, is that it's going to result in complete victory for Israel, or Israel achieving all of the pillars of its or objectives of its operation. The 5 that he mentioned next to Trump, one of them is completely defeating Hamas. Which really goes against, without explaining what happens to Hamas's members and so on, which really goes against the points that Trump was discussing about amnesty and so on. So my biggest issue, obviously, I've already raised several points, but here I think we are circling around one of the biggest themes and pitfalls of this plan, which is how ambiguous it is, and how it is left for interpretation by both the Israelis, the Palestinians, Hamas, the Palestinian leadership of Ramallah, the Arab leaders, and the Islamic leaders abroad, and then also the United States. And this is, again, the major pitfall with this plan, which has already resulted in some confusion. I've also read reports in U.S. media that the plan had changed between Trump's meeting with Arab and Islamic leaders and then what was made public after meeting with Netanyahu, particularly on issues that relate to addressing rhetoric inside of Israel towards the Palestinians, and certain other points that relate to the Israelis themselves, so Israel, and then the way that it's handling the war. There is ambiguity there. There's change, but for the moment, and perhaps this is something that you may maybe you were prepared to ask me at a later point. But for the moment, it's really the best option that exists from the Hamas's perspective. And this is me analyzing the situation from Hamas's perspective, from the Palestinians' perspective in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority as well, and then also the wider Arab and Islamic bloc. This is what is practical. This is what's achievable within the power relations that exist in the region and also internationally. And therefore, there is this big push towards at least stopping the war and then dealing with the ambiguity of this plan at a later date.
So this is a big, big day, a beautiful day, potentially one of the great days ever in civilization. Things that have been going on for hundreds of years and thousands of years. We're at a minimum, very, very close, and I think we're beyond very close. And I want to thank Bibi for really getting in there and doing a job. We've worked well together, as we have with many other countries, both of us, with many other countries, which is the only way this whole situation gets solved. And I'm not just talking about Gaza. Gaza is one thing, but we're talking about much beyond Gaza. The whole deal.
I read this in the Guardian's interpretation of the plan. It said a panel of experts will be convened to create what the plan calls a Trump economic development plan to build and energize the territory, which the US president has previously envisioned as, of course, transforming the area into a Riviera with a string of high-tech megacities. Now, this is where I see why Trump is getting so involved. Not only his bid for a Nobel Peace Prize, obviously, at some point in the future, I suppose, but this Riviera idea and how much money that could bring investors and, those interested in it from the West. Or am I being far too cynical? Have I gone too far down the conspiratorial pipeline here?
What I will comment on is that we are being too optimistic that the plan at this stage will result in a governing body to begin with. So I even rule that out, at least in the way that the plan is communicating that governing body. Again, I think the Palestinians have enough credentials and have many Palestinians who are well equipped to govern. This is regardless of obviously the wider rhetoric at the moment about the efficacy of Palestinian governance. So I doubt the fact that there will be a governing body composed in the way that the plan suggests, including Tony Blair as taking part in it, and also the United States president chairing it. And what I would also like to say is that for us, students of Middle East politics and economics, Gaza turning into the Singapore of the Middle East or into a Riviera is not a new suggestion. In the 1990s, it was widely discussed how the Oslo Accords was going to turn the Gaza Strip into the Singapore of the Middle East. So this is, and by the way, also using the same mechanism. So international aid, international governance, an international agreement guaranteed by the United States, facilitated for long-term peace proposals. So the same pillars, vaguely speaking, are also applied in this so-called plan or supposed peace plan, because some are also suggesting that it's going to lead to a peace plan between the Palestinians and Israelis at large, including by Trump, by the way. So that's what I will say, is that I don't think the governing body will even be composed to begin with. And I also doubt that the Singapore of the Middle East or the Riviera of the Middle East is going to be established in Gaza.
In terms of making sure, because you said that there are Palestinians very much capable of governing Palestine themselves, how do we make sure that those voices are on the table in future and it isn't just, the powers that be behind a big table, your Trumps, your Blairs, whoever else is going to be joining that committee?
It's so difficult for me to say this, but in a way, allowing the Palestinians to represent themselves. It is absurd that we still have conditionalities on the Palestinians. Well, we assume the Palestinians need to have reformed governance, so-called reformed governance and democracy and so on, and elections. But at the same time, we need to make sure who wins the election. And we need to make sure that that certain political parties or certain fields within the Palestinian larger political field don't win enough seats or to influence decision-making. So the Palestinians are capable of governing themselves, and the international community, again, should step back from this colonial mentality and allow the Palestinians to govern themselves. And quite frankly, if we are going to talk about reform and governance and who should speak on behalf of the Palestinians and so on, let's look at the Israeli side. We are having a convicted terrorist who is serving as a minister, and this is a convicted terrorist by Israeli law itself. And according to the words of previous heads of intelligence services or agencies inside of Israel. Here I'm talking about Ben Gvir. And we also have a self-described fascist who's serving as the Minister of Finance. So we are talking about individuals that are serving that in any other government would be unthinkable for them to serve and speak and represent such major ministerial positions, serving in the Israeli government. We're also talking about an Israeli government that has passed resolutions banning even the consideration of the establishment of a Palestinian political entity west of the Jordan River. So this is not an opinion in Israel, it's law. There's also the Jewish national law of 2018 that again says the right of determination for self-determination inside of the land of Israel without defining what the land of Israel is, which basically for any political interpretation inside of Israel means all of what we today call Palestine and Israel. So this law guarantees that the right for self-determination is only guaranteed to Jews inside of Greater Israel or the land of Israel, again, which means Palestine and Israel today. So if we are going to look at governance, it's how governments behave. The use of violence or force against civilians, starvation, violations of international law, then let's look at both sides. Let's look at who has been violating international law for decades, and so on. So I'm not a big fan of these discussions, and I know that I've taken a lot of time addressing this particular point, but going back to Palestinians having the credibility or the capacity to govern themselves, in 2011, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Commission, and the United Nations said that Palestinian institutions were ready to host or to govern a state, an independent state. And they were at par with countries in the region and many other countries in the developing world. So Palestinian institutions exist and they can govern. The biggest hindrance to this governance is obviously Israel's occupation over the Palestinians, and this has to be addressed.
Thanks for joining us, Anas.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.